Chapter 3. Party of Slavery. The Democrats' Defense of Oppression. In all ages of the world, some have labored and others have, without labor, enjoyed a large proportion of the fruits. This is wrong and should not continue. Abraham Lincoln, Fragment on Labor, 1847. In November 2014, Hillary Clinton made some revealing comments about illegal immigrants while receiving a History Maker Award from the New York Historical Society at the city's Mandarin Oriental Hotel. President Obama had just issued an executive order curbing the ability of law enforcement officials to deport illegal immigrants. Obama's actions circumvented the law, provoking a firestorm of criticism from many Republicans. Hillary rushed to Obama's defense, emphasizing why America needs illegals. We should remember that this is about people's lives. This is about, I would venture to guess, the people who served us tonight, who prepared our food tonight. Hillary's Democratic sympathizers in the audience burst into spontaneous applause. Hillary indeed made history that evening because, without quite intending to, she revealed why she and many Democrats support illegal immigration. Quite simply, her argument is that there is dirty work to be done, and someone has to do it. In Hillary's mind, hotels like the Mandarin Oriental cannot maintain elegant rooms and serve five-star cuisine without illegals cleaning the rooms, serving the food, and cleaning up afterward. One cannot, it seems, rely on Americans to do such jobs. The very idea that people might work for those wages and take pride in their work is incomprehensible to Hillary. The country no longer has slaves to do the dirty work, and so America needs illegal immigrants. The applause attending Hillary's remarks shows that she was not merely speaking for herself. Other Democratic fine diners that evening were very much on board with Hillary's position. Listening to Hillary that evening, I felt I was at a campaign rally for a Democratic presidential candidate in the mid-19th century. The feel was the same, and most important, the argument was the same. A century and a half ago, the issue wasn't illegal immigration, it was slavery. Democrats then justified slavery on the grounds that there was dirty work to be done and someone had to do it. Some of them even insisted that slavery benefited both the master and the slave because slavery gave full employment to people who were incapable of doing anything better than menial work. And here is Hillary Clinton making essentially the same case, not in defense of slavery, but in defense of illegal immigration. A few days after Hillary's comments, the Mandarin Oriental Hotel issued a press statement that it does not knowingly employ illegals. So Hillary was most likely wrong on the facts. But that's not what interests me about this episode, nor am I interested in pressing a direct analogy between slavery and illegal immigration. Obviously, the two issues are quite different. No, what interests me most here is the familiar attitude of superiority, condescension, and disdain. That was evident in the pro-slavery blather of the 19th century, and it was on full display at the Mandarin Oriental in November 2014. Democrats, it seems, never changed their stripes. Hillary's plan, I argue in this book, is the enslavement of America. Enslavement is not slavery, but it's related to slavery. Slavery is a condition, while enslavement is a process. Enslavement is the process of converting free into unfree citizens by confiscating their earnings, their resources, and their property in the form of taxes or fines. The ultimate end is the same. Our lives and even our hopes and dreams are now in someone else's control. We have become serfs, not of a plantation owner, but serfs of the progressive state. In order to understand enslavement, we need to understand slavery. This chapter focuses on the Democratic Party's role as the champion and defender of slavery. Oddly enough, slavery for many centuries needed no defenders because it had no critics. It was like the family, a long-standing institution that was simply taken for granted. But starting in the 17th century and continuing through the 19th century, slavery came under attack. The attack was two-pronged. The first prong of the attack was the American founding, which had no power to end slavery, but which established a framework for reducing, corralling, and ultimately placing slavery on a path to extinction. The second force, which emerged almost a century later, was the Republican Party, a party explicitly founded to block and then eliminate slavery, healing the crisis of the House divided, and creating a single union of free citizens. These attacks on slavery provoked the defense of slavery that formed the cornerstone of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party in the South invented the positive good school that argued slavery was good not only for the master but also for the slave. The champion of this school was the Democratic Senator John C. Calhoun. Northern Democrats, led by Senator Stephen Douglas, produced a subtler but no less invidious apologia for slavery. Popular sovereignty, a doctrine that allowed each state and territory to decide for itself whether it wanted slavery. Democrats on the Supreme Court also forged the majority in the notorious Dred Scott decision that upheld slavery and insisted that blacks have no rights that a white man needs to respect. Democratic presidents after Jackson, from Polk to Buchanan, protected slavery from abolitionist, free soil, and Republican attack. Even during the Civil War, many Northern Democrats, the so-called Copperheads or Peace Democrats, took the side of the Confederacy, urging Lincoln to make a deal with the slave-owning South. They tried, unsuccessfully, to defeat Lincoln for re-election in 1864. Finally, even after Lee surrendered at Appomattox, a small group of Democrats made a last-ditch attempt to save their cherished institution by assassinating Lincoln. Whitewashing history. Whoa, you might say. We never heard this story about the Democrats. Are you making this stuff up? Actually, no. Nothing I write in this chapter is controversial in terms of whether it happened or not. I am relying on the mainstream historians of slavery, David Bryan Davis, Kenneth Stamp, Eugene Genovese, Orlando Patterson. How, then, can my arguments sound so outrageous? The reason is that progressive Democrats have whitewashed the party's history. They have cleaned up the record. How? Well, they've done it in two ways. The first is to take the crimes of the Democratic Party and blame them on America. Progressives today are quick to fault America for slavery and a host of other outrages. America did this, America did that. As we will see in this book, America didn't do those things. The Democrats did. So the Democrats have cleverly foisted their sins on America and then presented themselves as the messiahs offering redemption for those sins. It's crazy, but it's also ingenious. We have to give them credit for ingenuity. The second whitewash is to portray the Civil War entirely in terms of the North versus the South. The North is supposedly the anti-slavery side, and the South is the pro-slavery side. A recent example is the Ta-Nehisi Coates article about the Confederate battle flag in the Atlantic. Now, of course, there is an element of truth in this, in that the Civil War was fought between northern states and southern states. But this neat and convenient division ignores several important details. First, the defenders of the Confederate cause were, almost without exception, Democrats. Coates cites many malefactors, from Senator Jefferson Davis to Senator James Henry Hammond to Georgia Governor Joseph Brown. Yet while identifying these men as Southerners and Confederates, Coates omits to identify them as Democrats. Second, Coates and other progressives conveniently ignore the fact that Northern Democrats were also protectors of slavery. We will see in this chapter how Stephen Douglas and other Northern Democrats fought to protect slavery in the South and in the new territories. Moreover, the Southerners who fought for the Confederacy cannot be said to have fought merely to protect slavery on their plantations. Indeed, fewer than 1/3 of white families in the South on the eve of the Civil War had slaves. Thus, the rigid North-South interpretation of the Civil War conceals, and is intended to conceal, the active complicity of Democrats across the country to save, protect, and even extend the peculiar institution. As the Charleston Mercury editorialized during the secession debate, the duty of the South was to rally under the banner of the Democratic Party, which has recognized and supported the rights of the South. The real divide was between the Democratic Party as the upholder of slavery and the Republican Party as the adversary of slavery. All the figures who upheld and defended American slavery, Senators John C. Calhoun and Stephen Douglas, President James Buchanan, Supreme Court Chief Justice Roger Taney, architect of the Dred Scott decision, and the main leaders of the Confederacy were Democrats. All heroes of black emancipation, from the black abolitionists Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass, to the woman who organized the Underground Railroad, Harriet Tubman, to the leader whose actions finally destroyed American slavery, Abraham Lincoln, were Republicans. It is of utmost importance to progressive propagandists to conceal or at least ignore this essential historical truth. Let's begin with the progressive indictment of the American founders. Jefferson didn't mean it when he wrote that all men are created equal, historian John Hope Franklin wrote. The truth is, we're bigoted people and always have been. Franklin argued that by betraying the principles of freedom and allowing slavery to continue, the Founding Fathers set the stage for every succeeding generation of Americans to apologize, compromise, and temporize on those principles. In the same vein, Senator Bill Bradley articulates the progressive view that slavery was our original sin, and former Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall refused to find the wisdom, foresight, and sense of justice exhibited by the framers particularly profound. The government they devised was defective from the start. Instead of jingoistic celebration, Marshall wrote, Americans should seek an understanding of the Constitution's defects. Notice the rhetoric here. We're a bigoted people. This is an African American talking. Does he mean that he himself is bigoted? Of course not. We here means Americans. So too with Bradley. Our original sin obviously doesn't refer to Bradley, who never owned slaves. Rather, it is an assumption of collective responsibility, or more accurately, an allocation of responsibility to America as a whole. In the progressive narrative, America is to blame, and the first offenders were the founders themselves. The progressive conclusion is that the founding was defective, setting up the progressive agenda to replace and move away from founding principles, what Obama called the remaking of America. Sins of the founders? So let's examine whether the progressives are right. Were the founders a pro-slavery lot who enshrined slavery in the new republic and in the new Constitution? Was their assertion in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal a big lie? If these charges are true, then America was indeed defective from the start. But they aren't true. This is not to deny that the founders were flawed and self-interested men, or that several of them owned slaves. Jefferson, for example, owned more than 200 slaves and never freed them. Washington also owned slaves and freed them only upon his death. Yet Jefferson's case is revealing. Far from rationalizing plantation life by adopting the happy slave arguments that would later become popular among Southern Democrats, Jefferson the Virginian vehemently denounced slavery as unfair and immoral. The Almighty has no attribute that can take side with us, he wrote. I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever. Moreover, Jefferson insisted that slavery was bad for slaves and bad for the masters. It was bad for the slaves because, unable to keep the fruits of their labor, they became unenterprising and slothful. Jefferson pointed out, however, that slavery had exactly the same effect on masters. Not having to do any work, masters too became unenterprising and slothful. Moreover, many masters exercised a despotic rule over their slaves, making them little tyrants in their own kingdom. These arguments may seem surprising coming from a slave owner, and they are. The remarkable thing is not that Jefferson the plantation owner had slaves, but that this slave-owning planter nevertheless declared that all men are created equal. Here we can instructively contrast Jefferson with the founder of the Democratic Party, Andrew Jackson. Unlike Jefferson, Jackson never expressed any doubt about the injustice of slavery. What provoked Jackson's indignation on the subject was abolitionist agitation. In his 1835 annual message to Congress, Jackson called for laws to prohibit under severe penalties the circulation in the Southern states through the mail of incendiary publications intended to instigate the slaves to insurrection. Jefferson, however, was typical of the founders in that he recognized slavery was wrong and that black people had rights. Confronted by those who justified slavery with the argument that blacks were intellectually inferior to whites, Jefferson retorted, "Whatever be their talents, it is no measure of their rights." If Jefferson and the founders knew that all men are created equal and that black people have rights, why not outlaw slavery and establish equality of rights under the law at the outset? The simple answer is that, had they done so, there would never have been a union. The founders in Philadelphia were not choosing whether to have a union with slavery or a union without slavery. They were choosing whether to have a union that had slavery or no union at all. If the founders decided not to have a union, then slavery would have continued in the various states. In that case, slavery may well have lasted much longer in America than it actually did. The founders chose a better option. They set a date a few years ahead for ending the slave trade. No more importation of slaves. They prohibited slavery in the Northwest Territory, essentially the modern Upper Midwest, including Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. Most important, they established a union on anti-slavery principles that nevertheless temporarily tolerated the practice of slavery. Nowhere in the Constitution is the term slavery used. Slaves are always described as persons, implying they have natural rights. The 3/5 clause, which some progressives have claimed shows the founders' low estimation of the worth of a black life, was actually a measure to curb the voting power of the slave-owning states. It helped eventually to swing the balance of power to the free states. The founders believed that these measures would, over time, weaken slavery and cause it to die out. In this, they were mistaken, because Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin in 1793, which the founders had no way to anticipate, revived the demand for slavery in the South. Still, the founders' efforts did weaken slavery. Before 1776, slavery was legal in every state. Yet by 1804, every state north of Maryland had abolished slavery either outright or gradually. Slavery was no longer a national but a sectional institution and one under moral and political siege. The Republican abolitionist Frederick Douglass, who had once denounced the founding as a hideous compromise with slavery, came to understand the accomplishment of the framers. "Abolish slavery tomorrow," he said, "and not a sentence or syllable of the Constitution needs to be altered." Slavery, he concluded, was merely scaffolding to the magnificent structure, to be removed as soon as the building was completed. Douglass knew that it would take Republican efforts to do this and finally end slavery. Anti-slavery activism, of course, preceded the Republican Party, although it finally found its most effective expression in that party. The earliest opponents of slavery in America were Christians, mostly Quakers and evangelical Christians. They took seriously the biblical idea that we are all equal in the eyes of God, and interpreted it to mean that no person has the right to rule another person without his consent. Remarkably, Christians discovered political equality through a theological interpretation of the Bible. For them, human equality is based not on an equality of human characteristics or achievements, but on how we are equally loved by God. Moreover, the argument against slavery and the argument for democracy both rested on the same foundation, a foundation based on human equality and individual consent. The American Anti-Slavery Society was founded in 1833. A few years later, the Liberty Party was founded to pursue emancipation. In 1848, the Liberty Party, anti-slavery Whigs, and Democrats who opposed the extension of slavery merged to form the Free Soil Party. Abolitionism, which sought the immediate end of slavery, had been present since the founding, but grew in political strength during the middle part of the 19th century. With the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, repealing the Missouri Compromise which curtailed the spread of slavery beyond the designated 3630 latitude, Free Soilers, former Whigs, and abolitionists joined together and created the Republican Party. Justifying slavery. These anti-slavery forces produced a massive national backlash in defense of slavery, not merely in the South, but also in the North. Today, it is difficult to meet anyone who defends slavery, and it is virtually inconceivable to imagine how slavery might be justified. To get a flavor of how plantation owners justified it, consider this anecdote from Mary Boykin Chestnut's diary about her husband James Chestnut, a Democratic senator from South Carolina. Asked if he ever had a problem with runaway slaves on his plantation, the doughty Democrat quipped, "Never. It's pretty hard work to keep me from running away from them." We can see from this witticism Senator Chestnut's assumption that he is doing the slaves a favor by housing, feeding, and taking care of them. In other words, they aren't supporting him. He's supporting them. He shouldn't be grateful to them. They should be grateful to him. This is the happy slave idea, and many slave owners and Southern Democrats believed it, so they could never understand the Republican contention that slaves might not want to be slaves, dismissing it as a form of outside agitation. Historically, the argument for slavery is one from necessity, and we find it in Aristotle. Aristotle insisted that some people are naturally inferior and incapable of governing themselves. Such people are natural slaves, and their enslavement is natural slavery. Yet Aristotle also recognized that many people were enslaved because they were captives who became the spoils of war. Slavery of this sort, Aristotle wrote, is conventional slavery, upheld not because it is right, but because of the custom or the way of the world. One might expect Aristotle to say that while natural slavery may be justifiable, conventional slavery is not. Aristotle, however, defends both types of slavery. His reason is practical. In every society, he argues, there is a great deal of hard work to be done, and if there is going to be leisure and art and contemplation, then some people have to do the dirty work so that others are freed up to devote themselves to higher pursuits. Slavery is simply the price that humanity must pay in order to have civilization. We can see that Aristotle's justification for slavery is essentially identical to Hillary's justification for illegal immigration. Who is going to serve us and do the dirty work, if not those people? Aristotle's argument hasn't just reached Democrats today. It also inspired Democrats in the early to middle part of the 19th century. Indeed, leading Democrats in the South picked up Aristotle's defense of slavery. In his celebrated King Cotton speech to the Senate in 1858, Democratic Senator James Hammond argued, "In all social systems, there must be a class to do the menial duties, to perform the drudgery of life. Such a class you must have, or you would not have that other class which leads progress, civilization, and refinement." So far, Hammond is completely in line with his Greek predecessor. We can also trace a very interesting line that goes from Hammond to Hilary. Hammond, however, goes much further than Aristotle when he continues that slavery is no evil. On the contrary, I believe it to be the greatest of all blessings. Providence, he declares, has produced in the slave-owning South the highest-toned, the purest, best organization of society that has ever existed on the face of the earth. Hammond insists that slaves don't have it too bad in being slaves. Our slaves are hired for life, he says, and well compensated. There is no starvation, no begging, no want of employment. Remarkably, Hammond goes to add that free laborers who don't have food, lodging, or health care provided to them are worse off than slaves. He calls them a hireling class that is hired for the day and not cared for, while slaves, he insists, are provided for in all their basic needs. Echoing Hammond, Democratic Senator Albert Gallatin of Mississippi contended that slavery was a great moral, social, and political blessing, a blessing to the slave and a blessing to the master. According to Gallatin, slavery freed gentlemen to cultivate literature and the arts and devote themselves to public service, in contrast to vulgar, contemptible, counter-jumping Yankees. At the same time, Gallatin said slavery benefited the slaves because it took African savages and made them into useful workers, while also giving them lifelong protection and provision. We hear the same tune from another Southern Democrat, the writer George Fitzhugh, who argued that slavery is the natural and normal condition of society, while free labor was abnormal and anomalous. Fitzhugh didn't just want slavery to continue, he wanted it to expand. The South would never have independence or equality, he wrote, until our equal right to increase, expansion, and protection is fully admitted and acted on. The founding doctrine of equality of rights, Fitzhugh insisted, was simply a mechanism for giving license to the strong to oppress the weak. While free laborers must at all times work or starve, Fitzhugh wrote, slaves are supported whether they work or not. Slavery, Fitzhugh concluded, was an early form of social insurance. It may even be termed an embryonic form of socialism. Undoubtedly, the most notorious defender of slavery was Democratic Senator John C. Calhoun from South Carolina. Calhoun was an enthusiastic Andrew Jackson supporter, and in 1828 he became Jackson's vice president, although the two men would subsequently have a falling out. Progressive historians like to portray Calhoun as a quintessential Southerner in order to italicize their North-South interpretation of the Civil War. In reality, historian Clyde Wilson points out that Calhoun was controversial even in his home state. He was not a typical Southerner. In fact, he may have been just as popular in the North as in the South. According to Wilson, he had substantial support and admiration in many parts of the North, from Boston to New York to Philadelphia to Cincinnati to Detroit. Slavery as a positive good. Calhoun's positive good defense of slavery is laid out in a series of his speeches before the U.S. Senate. In an 1837 speech, Calhoun argued, "There never has yet existed a wealthy and civilized society in which one portion of the community did not, in point of fact, live on the labor of the other." Here is Calhoun contending that slavery is simply a response, one may say, to Aristotelian necessity. But Calhoun went further, attacking the Declaration of Independence and thus separating himself from Jefferson. Calhoun attributed the assault on slavery as arising out of great and dangerous errors that have their origin in the prevalent opinion that all men are free and equal. Nothing can be more unfounded and false. Men are not equal, Calhoun emphasized, and therefore some are destined for freedom, and others are marked for servitude. Calhoun, like Hammond, contended that slaves were improved by slavery, making them not only better off than they were before, but also happy. Never before has the black race of Central Africa, from the dawn of history to the present day, attained a condition so civilized and so improved, not only physically, but morally and intellectually. It came among us in a low, degraded, and savage condition, and in the course of a few generations it has grown up under the fostering care of our institutions to its present comparatively civilized condition. This, with the rapid increase of numbers, is conclusive proof of the general happiness of the race, in spite of all the exaggerated tales to the contrary. Calhoun rhapsodized that every plantation is a little community, with the master as its head, who concentrates in himself the united interests of capital and labor, of which he is the common representative. In this benign environment, he insisted, the slaves could really thrive. For Calhoun, slavery was a veritable school of civilization, although not a school from which the slaves were permitted to graduate. These arguments by Southern Democrats appear to have vanished into the mist of history. They are rarely taught, scarcely read, and hardly remembered. Progressives don't want us to remember them, yet they are worth remembering for three separate reasons. First, they are unique. Historian Eugene Genovese says that nowhere in the New World outside the democratic South did anyone celebrate slavery as a good thing for the slave. In Brazil, for example, there was widespread slavery and, according to Genovese, slavery was defended as economically necessary and traditionally sanctioned, but no one argued with any discernible conviction that it was a good thing in itself or the proper condition of the laboring classes. Second, the pro-slavery philosophy of the Southern Democrats shaped important events in American history. The right of property in a slave is distinctly and expressly affirmed in the Constitution. This sentence is from the Dred Scott decision issued by a Supreme Court dominated by Jackson Democrats. The statement is a lie. Nowhere does the Constitution distinctly and expressly affirm slavery. This can easily be verified by reading the Constitution today. Yet the statement does reflect the perverted democratic interpretation of the Constitution promulgated by the pro-slavery Democratic contingent. These are the people who wanted to keep their slaves and recover slaves who escaped to free states, and so they twisted the Constitution to achieve their self-serving objectives. No wonder that President James Buchanan, a Democrat, hailed the Supreme Court's decision. The right has been established of every citizen to take his property of any kind, including slaves, into the common territories and to have it protected there. Neither Congress nor a territorial legislature nor any human power has any authority to annul or impair this vested right. Ultimately, the Southern Democrats became so dug in with their positive good philosophy that they pressed for secession immediately upon Lincoln's election. A less recalcitrant group might have stayed in the Union. In this case, slavery would likely have endured longer than it did. So the positive good philosophy was actually instrumental in instigating the Civil War and, against the wishes of its proponents, bringing about a quicker end to slavery than would otherwise have been the case. Third and finally, the arguments of the Southern Democrats are worth recalling because we will see Democrats make very similar arguments, actually the same ones, once again during the New Deal. Only this time, the master had a new name, the federal government, administered by progressives according to progressive principles. Incredibly, those positive good arguments would be pitched in the 1930s, and subsequently not to sympathetic whites, but to blacks themselves. The complicity of the Northern Democrats. The Northern Democratic defense of slavery was epitomized by Stephen Douglas, who made a new and ingenious defense of black servitude that went under the banner of popular sovereignty. Douglas was no friend of blacks, and routinely referred to them as niggers. In his second debate with Lincoln in the Illinois Senate race, for instance, Douglas said, "Those of you who believe that the is your equal and ought to be on an equality with you socially, politically, and legally, have a right to entertain those opinions and, of course, will vote for Mr. Lincoln. In the third debate, Douglas bluntly asserted, "I hold that a Negro is not and never ought to be a citizen of the United States. I hold that this government was made on the white basis, made by white men, for the benefit of white men and their posterity forever, and should be administered by white men and none others." Indeed, Douglas went on to suggest that since many of the founders had slaves, clearly they couldn't have meant what they said, that all men are created equal. Interestingly, Democrats today make the same point about the founders, not to defend white supremacy, but to suggest that the founders are hypocrites whose ideals, as set forth in the Constitution, should give way to progressive alternatives. The resemblance between today's Democrats and the Democratic Douglas goes even further. Douglas's argument for popular sovereignty regarding slavery is identical in substance and very nearly in form to the Democratic Party's position on abortion today. Let's follow the argument more closely. Douglas professed to be indifferent himself to whether slavery was voted up or down. To the degree he confessed to an opinion, he implied he was personally opposed to slavery and would not have slaves himself, as indeed he couldn't since he lived in the free state of Illinois. Even so, Douglas contended that popular sovereignty was a democratic solution to an otherwise insoluble problem that threatened to divide the country and plunge it into chaos. The solution, Douglas said, is for Americans to agree to disagree. Specifically, each state and territory should decide for itself whether to have slavery. Douglas staked his position not on the right or wrong of slavery, but firmly on the right to choose. For Douglas, the moral dignity of slavery came not from its own merits, but from its affirmation through the democratic process. Douglas sought to resolve the contradiction of the American founding, to eliminate its hypocrisy, if you will, on the slavery issue, by placing slavery itself on a democratic foundation. Here we see the resemblance to the Democrats' contemporary pro-choice position on abortion. Both are efforts to take something that destroys the life and liberty of another and make it into a political good. Both embrace the high ground of freedom or choice in order to cancel out the choices of others. Both use the language of democracy to deny the fundamental equality of others who are somehow placed outside the orbit of humanity. In one case, it is the planter who makes the choice. In another, it is the pregnant woman. In one case, the choice involves owning and enslaving a black person. In the other, it involves destroying an emerging life in the womb. Still, one can hardly deny the similarities. This method of reasoning seems to be part of the Democrats' political DNA, from their pro-choice arguments about slavery to their pro-choice arguments about abortion. Douglas's popular sovereignty doctrine was reflected in the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which Douglas maneuvered through the Congress. It was a legislative victory for Douglas, yet the act also precipitated vehement opposition, leading to the rise of Abraham Lincoln and the founding of the Republican Party. Speaking on behalf of the emerging Republican coalition, Lincoln's arguments against Douglas exposed the facade of the pro-choice position, revealing it as facially neutral, but actually a form of oppression. Lincoln's logic, we will see, applies equally against slavery then as it does against abortion now. Lincoln destroyed popular sovereignty by exposing the contradiction at the core of the doctrine. Yes, Lincoln said, democracy involves the right to choose, but the right to choose cannot be defended without considering what is being chosen. Pro-choice, in other words, depends for its validity on the content of the choice. How, Lincoln asked, can Douglas Democrats invoke choice to deprive black people of their right to choose? Can popular consent legitimately take away other people's right to consent? Lincoln insisted that it could not. With equal acumen, Lincoln destroyed the positive good defense of slavery. He compared the position of the Calhoun Democrats to a pack of wolves devouring lambs, while pretending that this was good for the lambs. Lincoln said he was weary of hearing Democrats preach about how good slavery was for the slaves. If slavery was so good, he suggested, why don't Democrats try it on themselves by becoming slaves? For Lincoln, slavery was a form of theft. The core of it was summarized in the phrase, "You work, I eat." The slave owner, in other words, was a thief, stealing not only the labor but also the life of the slave. Democratic apologists for slavery were no better than facilitators and sustainers of this system of theft. Lincoln pointed out that even popular sovereignty, the supposedly moderate position of the Northern Democrats, represented not just theft, but perpetual theft. Lincoln accused Douglas of placing slavery where he openly confesses he has no desire there shall ever be an end of it. Lincoln found this position abhorrent because he, together with his fellow Republicans, believed that slavery was morally wrong. This belief, of course, did not by itself settle the issue. Lincoln knew that the founders had allowed slavery in the Southern states in order to have a union. He believed that no matter how much he abhorred slavery, it was not within his power or the power of Congress to nullify that original pact. In other words, the federal government was constitutionally prohibited from regulating slavery in the Southern states. The Constitution, however, said nothing about new territories that were coming into the Union. Lincoln argued that therefore Congress had every right and full power to keep slavery out of these new territories. Lincoln's position was that, within the parameters established by the Constitution, the evil of slavery should be restricted and contained. His opponents, on the other hand, wanted slavery to continue and expand. As Lincoln neatly summarized the difference, one side believes slavery is right and ought to be extended, while the other believes it is wrong and ought to be restricted. Fruits of one's labor. By contrast with the Democrats, Lincoln defended the free labor system. Such a system, he contended, not only protected liberty, it was also just. People have a right to the fruits of their labor. Once again, Lincoln spoke in simple terms that everyone could understand. I always thought the man who made the corn should eat the corn. The hand that produces the bread, Lincoln said, has the right to put that bread into its own mouth. No other man has a claim on that bread, and no other man can justly take away the fruits of another man's labor. Lincoln combined his condemnation of slavery with a defense of free labor and earned achievement. He articulated for his time and ours the core principle of the Republican Party. Republicans, Lincoln said, were the party of entrepreneurship. Lincoln understood that nothing has raised the American standard of living more than new inventions and innovations. When we contemplate how people's lives have been improved from a slew of new inventions, from the steam engine to the iPhone, I don't see how anyone can disagree with Lincoln about this. In a speech on patents and copyrights, Lincoln defended the patent laws as adding the fuel of interest to the fire of innovation. In other words, people are more likely to build new things that benefit others and raise the overall standard of society when they get to own and benefit from their creations. Lincoln celebrated the American system of discoveries, inventions, and improvements. Minerals, he pointed out, have long subsisted under the Earth's surface. They lay idle, however, until someone figured out how to get them out and harness them to productive use. Republicans, according to Lincoln, are not just the party of entrepreneurship and invention, they are also the party of the little guy making his way up the ladder. Sure, that guy may have to start out working for another, but Lincoln insisted he must do so as a free man, on terms to which he gave consent. In time, Lincoln hoped, men could free themselves from dependence and work for themselves. And if they were successful, perhaps they would be able to hire others to work for them. This, Lincoln said, is the free labor system, offering what Lincoln termed equal chances in the race of life. Lincoln never defended rich people. His Republican Party was not the party of the 1%. Rather, Lincoln defended upward mobility, the right to try one's chances at moving up the ladder, at getting rich. Lincoln's Republican Party sought to remove government obstacles to that process. In his time, the main such obstacle was slavery. Slavery, Lincoln knew, hurt the value of people's work because it placed them in competition with slaves who worked for nothing. Today's Republicans make a similar point about illegal immigrant labor. Illegal immigrants don't have to pay taxes. For this and other reasons, they can price their labor markedly below that of citizens. Consequently, illegal immigration harms the upward mobility of American workers. Today's Democrats howl that such rhetoric is racist, but since there is no implication of racial inferiority, the charge is baseless. Democrats make it only because they derive political benefits from illegal immigration. In reality, the GOP is right that illegal immigration has held back the standard of living of many American workers, making it difficult for them to achieve the upward mobility that Lincoln knew epitomized the American dream. For Democrats, then as now, these concepts of upward mobility and getting rich through one's own efforts were anathema. The Democratic Party, then as now, is all about confiscating the fruits of other people's labor. Consequently, Democrats in the North and the South attacked Lincoln with all the political weapons they could muster. These Democrats, led by Douglas, accused Lincoln of seeking to destroy slavery in the South and of being a covert believer in equal rights for blacks, the black right to vote, and also miscegenation, or the right of blacks to intermarry with whites. These, especially the miscegenation accusation, were incendiary charges in the mid-19th century. Interestingly, while Democrats in 1860 said Lincoln wanted to free all their slaves, today's progressive Democrats today make exactly the opposite accusation charge. They claim Lincoln did not really care about slavery and fought the Civil War for reasons other than emancipation. They point to a famous letter to Horace Greeley in which Lincoln said his overriding goal was to save the Union, not end slavery, and if he could save the Union without freeing a single slave, he would do it. Artful evasions. So who is right, the old Democrats or the new ones? Actually, the Democrats of 1860 were closer to the mark than the Democrats of today. Lincoln did in fact believe not merely in ending slavery, but also in extending the vote and equal rights to blacks. He also seems to have had no objection whatever to racial intermarriage. Still, Lincoln realized that he could not admit to holding these positions in public. For Lincoln to make the election of 1860 about issues like the black vote or miscegenation, opposed by wide majorities of Americans of all political stripes, would be to assure his political defeat. If the Democrats defeated the Republicans in 1860, the South would not have seceded and American slavery would have continued. Thus we have from Lincoln artfully evasive statements like, "I do not understand that because I do not want a Negro woman for a slave, I must necessarily want her for a wife." Also, in response to Democratic proclamations of the inferiority of the black man, "If God gave him but little, that little let him enjoy." Lincoln is nowhere saying that blacks are inferior. He's not saying he rejects the idea of blacks marrying whites. He is simply refusing to go there. He is keeping the debate where it ought to be, on the simple question of whether people should be permitted to steal other people's life and labor by enslaving them. Of the black woman he says, "In her natural right to eat the bread she earns with her own hands without asking leave of anyone else, she is my equal and the equal of all others." So today's Democrats who fault Lincoln for his unenlightened views about blacks are being disingenuous. Lincoln's views were not unenlightened. Rather, in statesmanlike fashion, Lincoln was simply refusing to admit his desire to do things that he could not in any case do. He was also refusing to let Democrats like Douglas change the subject from the extension of slavery, the main divide between the parties, to other peripheral subjects. Similarly, when Lincoln insisted the Civil War was about the Union, not about slavery, this is understood by competent historians to reflect Lincoln's determination to keep border states, Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri, within the Union. These states had slavery, and if Lincoln framed the war as one to end slavery, the border states would have seceded. If they seceded, Lincoln believed the Union cause was lost. Once again, Lincoln acted in statesmanlike fashion to hold the border states, and he was successful in doing so, thus shortening the war and ending slavery more quickly. The Democrats of the mid-19th century didn't just castigate the Republicans. At times, they physically assaulted them. A dramatic example occurred in 1856 when Republican Senator Charles Sumner gave an especially stern denunciation of slavery on the floor of the U.S. Senate. In response, Democratic Senator Preston Brooks walked up to Sumner and struck him repeatedly with his cane. Sumner was seriously injured, and his health suffered for the rest of his life. This Democratic outrage helped persuade many Americans that there was no way to rationally resolve the slavery issue with pro-slavery Democrats. Democrats despised abolitionists like Sumner and John Brown, but most of all they hated the Republican Party. That's because the Republican Party, unlike the abolitionists, was actually capable of winning a national election and preventing slavery from going into the new territories. Many Democrats feared that if slavery were not permitted to expand, it would inevitably decline. The relative power of free states would continually increase, and slavery's tenure would soon be over. This fear is why the slave states seceded, thus precipitating the Civil War. The firmness of Lincoln and the Republicans from the time of Lincoln's election through the conduct of the war should be an example for Republicans today. Lincoln could probably have prevented the war by compromising his position that slavery could continue in the South but would be barred from extending into the new territories. Several such compromises, including the so-called Crittenden Compromise, were advanced to avert the danger of secession and war. The Crittenden Compromise guaranteed the permanent existence of slavery in all states and territories demarcated by the Missouri Compromise line. It also affirmed popular sovereignty as the mechanism by which new territories could become slave states or free states. Historians recognize that perhaps the only way to avert the Civil War in that late stage was for Lincoln to embrace the Crittenden Compromise or something akin to it. Yet Lincoln refused to do this, and in this sense, he refused to do the one thing that could have avoided the war. Lincoln would not bend even one iota on his position. He refused to concede any ground to the democratic doctrine of popular sovereignty. Lincoln argued that for him to do so would be to negate the very result of the 1860 election. In effect, Lincoln would be allowing the very people who lost the election to win it simply by making their demands the necessary condition for them staying in the Union. Lincoln would be selling out the American people in order to appease disgruntled Democrats. This he would not do. In 1863, Lincoln signed his Emancipation Proclamation, freeing slaves in the Confederacy. Solid Republican majorities in the House and the Senate supported this proclamation. The Copperheads, or Peace Democrats, opposed it, making it clear they favored maintaining the Union but not freeing the slaves. The slogan of the Copperhead Democrats was, "The Union as it was, the Constitution as it is." In other words, let's keep the Union, and let's also keep slavery. Today's progressives blast Lincoln and the Republicans for the limited scope of the Emancipation Proclamation, sarcastically noting it freed slaves not under Union control, while, at least for the present, keeping in captivity slaves who were. Once again, Lincoln's actions can be understood as preserving Union power. For Lincoln to have freed slaves in the border states would have risked further secession or at least widespread political division. Lincoln's challenge was to keep the Union forces together so that the war could be prosecuted to a successful conclusion. Winning the war was the sine qua non of permanently abolishing slavery. Throughout the war, Lincoln's Democratic opponents in the North, the Copperheads or Peace Democrats, sought to undermine him and the Republicans. The Copperheads sought to weaken Lincoln so that he could not be reelected. They called him a nigger in principle and urged Americans to defeat his Negroism. This was the vocabulary in which the Democratic campaign of 1864 was conducted. Fire in the rear. Lincoln recognized the threat from the Copperheads. He called these peace Democrats the fire in the rear, and he regarded them as just as dangerous as the armies of the Confederacy. If Lincoln had been defeated, the Copperheads would undoubtedly have sought to reconcile with the Confederacy, largely on Confederate terms. Lincoln's reelection sealed the fate of the peace Democrats and also the fate of slavery. But even after the surrender of the Confederacy, a surrender that presaged the final destruction of slavery, there were Democrats who refused to accept the outcome. One of them, John Wilkes Booth, decided to take action. Booth was a Confederate sympathizer from Maryland. Earlier, Booth had joined a volunteer militia of Democrats in attendance at the hanging of abolitionist John Brown. Booth and the Democrats came armed to prevent abolitionists from rescuing Brown from the gallows. 2 days after Lee's surrender, Lincoln gave a speech at the White House in which he suggested that some blacks should get the vote. That did it for Booth, who gathered a group of like-minded Democrats who resolved to assassinate not only President Lincoln, but also the Vice President and the Secretary of State. This was nothing short of an attempted coup. The coup failed. Booth did kill Lincoln, who became the first president in American history to be assassinated. But the co-conspirators did not kill Vice President Johnson or Secretary of State Seward, although Seward was gravely injured. There was a national backlash against the conspirators. Booth was killed in a shootout with the authorities, and 8 co-conspirators were tried and 4 were hanged. Thus, the last effort of Democrats to save the institution of slavery ended in ignominy. But the Democrats were not finished. They were down, but not out. Soon, as we will see in the next chapter, the Democrats moved on to a new nefarious scheme of oppression and theft, one that was almost as despicable as slavery.